has been kind of adopted as the ecosystem term for the riparian forest, cottonwood forest that lines, in my case, the Rio Grande where I work, but it's a general term of in New Mexico of the Bosque, the treed area along the riparian zone. So a little background, as you can see, I work at the Pueblo of Sandia. They are the Pueblo that is between basically Albuquerque and Bernalillo, and they have about 9 river miles. 9 miles of the Rio Grande that run along their western border, and about 800 to 1,000 acres of bosque, depending on how you define that. And so my main job there is doing projects in there that reduce fuels in the interest of trying to prevent fires, and also looking towards habitat restoration, both for the long-term benefit of the bosque itself, and then specifically for endangered species, which I'll talk more about. I'll throw in a little interesting side note. One of the people often ask if, a job at Pueblo is much different than any place else. And I say, actually, 90% of my job is just like any other job. I show up, I sit in front of a computer, I manage, I go to meetings, I manage budgets and apply for grants and everything you would expect from a project manager. But there's the other 10% of my job, which is actually either being interfaced with tribal council, which is a very different experience than a lot of, say, going to a board or whatever. And then there's days like today where you show up and then the Pueblo gets closed unexpectedly for some culturally important purpose. And in my case, having to head up to HR to find a computer. And with that, part of the reason I throw that out is some of these slides are a little dated, and but the overall intent and message is there. But I was going to change out some things, and that was in the mix-up today, or not in the mix-up, but in the having to readjust my schedule today. I wasn't able to do that. So. But the first thing I'm going to jump into is as Kristen mentioned, is I'm an avid volunteer with the Albuquerque Wildlife Federation, and I was told I could give a plug for the Albuquerque Wildlife Federation, and so I'm going to do so shamelessly. This is a group, as she mentioned, it was started by the visionary conservationist Aldo Leopold, most famous for San County Almanac, where he laid out his land ethic that really just states that humans are simply part of the environment, not above or beyond it. And once we learn to see ourselves as part of that environmental community, part of that natural community, we will tend to treat it better. The more time passes, the more we realize we should have always gone with what Aldo had to tell us. What interesting thing, and where I'm directly following in Aldo's footsteps, is not just that I volunteer for the organization that he started, but that he, when he lived in Albuquerque, he was actually a president of the Chamber of Commerce, or secretary, sorry, of the Albuquerque Chamber of Commerce. And through that, he used his leverage to convince the city basically to preserve the bosque along the river, which is one of the main reasons, unlike so many cities, Albuquerque actually has a functional bosque running through the middle of its city instead of just a cement ditch, as many cities have done to their main rivers. So a lot of kudos to Aldo, and we're forever grateful for that. So more about the Albuquerque Wildlife Federation. We're an all volunteer group. We operate on 8 to 12 board members. I think we currently have 10. If you'd like our monthly e-newsletter, just simply go to the website you see there, or enter the whole entire name, and it'll come up in any search engine. Our main activities in this day and age is we host bi-monthly programs, just like what you're tuning into now, where we have people come in and talk about issues relevant to wildlife and conservation. But even more important, and the thing that keeps me going, is the monthly restoration projects that we do from March to October. We get out and get our hands dirty and work on the ground, mostly doing riparian or river restoration type projects, and I'll talk more about that in a second. Our last project of 2020 is Saturday, October 24th. It's a local project at Cedro Creek, just in the East Mountains behind Albuquerque, and a long-time project there that we've been doing. And if you haven't been on one before, it's a great one to come to because it's only a day, and you can really see kind of the end results of a lot of the things we do. And what we do is often build rock structures like what you see in the middle photo there. And it looks like a pile of rocks, but it's actually strategically placed and strategically designed to maximize the amount of water that can be held back by any given structure. And when that water is held back, it actually has time to soak into the system and benefit the riparian vegetation that grows along our riparian systems. Check out the screen yourself. Some pictures here. The particular person I would also like to point out, someone almost as visionary as Alva Leopold, as far as I'm concerned. His name is Bill Zedike, and you can see there by the white beard, he's a retired forester, spent a lot of time just observing nature, which Aldo certainly would have encouraged, and helped develop the concept of a lot of these structures himself just by observing how things worked and being willing to try and fail. He did a lot of things that didn't quite work, but through that he's perfected his technique. And in the lower photo here, you can see him using his walking stick to guide somebody on what to do next. That would most benefit the riparian zone. Here we are doing fence exclosures just to protect vegetation from grazing. And this photo over here is at the Valle de Oro, the National Wildlife Refuge in the South Valley, where past a few years we joined in with their efforts to basically turn an old farm field into a wildlife refuge, like a bona fide, riparian zone with all kinds of interesting wetland features going in and everything. If you haven't been there in a while, go check it out. It's a lot of construction going on, but this is us helping participate in that process by planting willows and cottonwoods. Okay, getting to the main part of my talk, which is, like I said, my expertise is more the Middle Rio Grande Valley. I've worked at the Pueblo for 9 years. As mentioned before that, I worked in various locations, and I mostly worked on small arroyos or high elevation areas or stuff like that. So jumping down to the Rio Grande and a full large bosque was quite a change, but I found that a lot of the concepts that I learned in the smaller systems do apply. What's different about the Rio Grande is it's of course shared by 3 states and 2 countries. Those 3 states obviously being Colorado, New Mexico, and Texas, 2 countries being the United States and Mexico. There's a compact that basically shares the water between the 3 states, and international treaties that work out sharing the water between the 2 countries. So that's obviously a lot different than working on a high mountain stream where basically you're just working with the Forest Service and the Army Corps on the permitting issues or whatever. So it was quite a learning experience when I first got there, and obviously there's more to learn about everything we do, so I'm still doing that. But if you're really interested in diving in deep, this is the cover of the book where I got a lot of my information, and it was put together by the Forest Service, in particular Dan Skurlock, but because it's a Forest Service document, you can look it up online and read for you and download it yourself. It's free because it's a Forest Service publication. It's like 400 pages long, so there's a ton of information in there, and obviously I'm not going to go into that level of detail, and that wouldn't be what my talk is getting at. What I'd like to get towards is the methods that we're using to take a river that, like so many of our landscapes out, especially out west, has been beaten up pretty good, and we're learning more about those systems and trying to learn how to tinker with them, if you will, to improve their function and maintain some semblance of a functional ecosystem. To go back to Aldo again, one of his more famous quotes is, "The most important part with intelligent tinkering is to save all the parts." And that's a really good motto to go by for basically just anytime you're going into a big ecosystem and trying to finesse it to do what you're calling restoration, which is a subjective term unto itself. The first thing to do is save all the parts, and then just observe and learn more about what you're being part of. Other documents that I really got a lot from, and this is where my focus isn't just the entire Middle Rio Grande Valley. It's obviously my backyard my work is the Pueblo of Sandia. So I have a very geographically distinct piece of the river that I'm interested in. And so documents like this that are the geomorphology and how it's changed, and I'll go more into that as we go through this presentation. This one in particular is specific right below Bernalillo down to the Alameda Bridge, if you're familiar with where those are geographically. So in order to kind of set the stage for the restoration that we do, that I participate in, and kind of the theories behind them and what we're trying to accomplish, and why we're even where we're at, is you have to understand the immense changes that the Rio Grande itself has gone through, not just in the past 100 years, which there was intense amount of change, as is no surprise probably to most of you, all across, where lots of dams went in, lots of infrastructure went in, cities built up along rivers, forcing them to be constrained, and everything else that went with it. It goes back, several hundred years to when really we started seeing in the 1700s the influx of population pressure from people coming in and settling in the Middle Rio Grande Valley. And then with that, in particular, bringing in sheep. And the overgrazing of the watershed above the Rio Grande resulted in mass amounts of sediment being sent down the watershed and into the Rio Grande. And then the other part of that is wood was actually pretty scarce. And we think of the Bosque these days as this kind of endless sea of cottonwood trees from Jetty Dam down to Elephant Butte. And that really is a very modern creation, if you will, that only goes back to like the 30s and 40s, really. And prior to that, there really was not much of a bosque to be found, and I'll go more into that in a second. 1800s, basically this all accelerated as not only from the overgrazing, but logging, road building, irrigation, mining, everything that goes with that. And what this results in is, as I mentioned, the watershed, is being overgrazed. That vegetation is no longer able to hold its soil in place. And so every time a rain comes along, a lot of that sediment is washed downward. And of course, ultimately, any tributary around here ends up in the Rio Grande. And so all these tributaries are bringing in a large amount of sediment. Rivers move sediment all the time. That's part of what rivers do, but this is like an abnormally large amount. And so what you have is a very instantaneous point where you can see that where I work in the Bernalillo, or at Sandia Pueblo, between Bernalillo and Alameda, you can really see where there's a level where there's nothing but sand and gravel, which was the Rio Grande of 100 to 200 years ago, and then nothing but fine sediment, which was the Rio Grande of the late 1800s coming into now, or coming into the 70s, when lots of sediment was being added to the system, and therefore the bed of the Rio Grande actually physically lifted or raised. It, aggraded was the term. And agrading and degrading are terms in riparian or river systems that degrading we always think of as like a negative term, and that isn't necessarily the case all the time, but in this case it probably is. A degrading system means the bed is actually dropping, and agrading means too much sediment is coming into the system and changing the natural parameters that the river has operated under over time. 1900s, this of course continues, but as more and more people started farming along the sides of the Rio Grande in the floodplain, all that agraded sediment also was becoming saturated with water. And so fields were either waterlogged, so you can't farm them, or when the water would come into the fields and then leave again, it would leave behind a lot of calcium and other minerals, and so created what's called alkaline soils, which is also not good for growing crops. And so this kind of combination of pressure between the needs of farming, population pressures in the Middle Rio Grande Valley, And this waterlogged soil problem led ultimately to the creation of the Middle Rio Grande Conservancy District, which was formed in 1923 by the New Mexico State Legislature. And they began a period of very intensive building of diversion dams, irrigation infrastructure, riverbank protection, which is really kind of a way of saying we're trying to force the river to stay where it is at that point in time so we don't have to worry about it. And of course, riverside levees and drains. And the drains are really going to be what's important in this day and age. They are super effective at what they do. They're called drains because they basically are carved, a ditch that is carved along the side of a river, and all the fields on the non-river side, if you will, are then that the water in those fields then goes into the drain and is carried off. It's very effective and very good if that's what you're trying to do, but in the long term, that is now a problem because we've flipped the system on its head, and I'll talk more about that as we go. 19s and 40s and 50s is interesting to note because most of the bosque you see today, not all of it, but most of the bosque you see today was from big floods from that time period. Cottonwoods are a flood adapted tree, meaning they respond to the spring floods that comes from the snowmelt from the mountains. They send out their seed, that's why they're called cottonwoods, that fluffy seed that floats in the air and lands, and then generally makes its way to the outer edges of where the floods are that year. And then if conditions are right and the soil's wet enough, they'll generate new cottonwoods. And so it was the really big floods of the 40s and 50s that generated most of the bosque we see today. And all of these are things we'll come back to. 1950s to the 1970s, the Army Corps and other agencies install over 100,000 jetty jacks for river protection and to further channelize the river. I'll talk more about these, but basically at that point, they're really saying where the river is at that point in time, we are anchoring it with these jetty jacks and forcing it to stay in that place. And we'd already done so with drains and levees, but the jetty jacks really kind of sealed the deal, if you will. And then 1973, Cochiti Dam is completed. And at this point now, you've got dams on the Chama, the Jemez, which is a major tributary, Galisteo, obviously a major tributary. And so what was a system that generally had too much sediment going into it gets cut off at the D's, and the whole thing flips on its head. And no sediment is coming into the system because now all the sediment has been trapped behind these assorted dams, especially Cochiti Dam. And the problem with that is, as I mentioned earlier, rivers move sediment. That's what they do. But if you're moving sediment downstream and more is coming in from upstream, you will generally have probably a slow aggradation over time, let's say, especially in a place like a wide basin like a Middle Rio Grande Valley. But if you suddenly flip the system on its head and take all the sediment out, then what comes out at the base of the dam is clear. It's nice, clear water. It's what they call sediment starved. And it is very easy for that water to grab sediment and take it downstream more than it would be able to if it already had a sediment load in it. So it can take a bunch of sediment and start moving downstream, only now you're not replacing that sediment with sediment from above. And so it's a very instantaneous process of starting to degrade this river, meaning the bed of the river is actually physically lowering. And remember, this comes on top of very intentional channelizing. So the river was already confined to a narrow area, and now it's sediment starved and very easy for it to remove sediment. And so we'll continue on with that as we go. So I've already mentioned, here's some pictures just to underscore the grazing by the sheep, in particular sheep, although cows also do their fair share. But the sheep in particular, they eat everything in their path as opposed to cows that are a little more selective. And sheep were able to be put out in higher numbers. So that was really the overgrazing trigger that sent a lot of sediment down into the watershed. And then the other picture, both of these are from that Dan Skurlock book that I showed at the beginning. And then the second one is just the sheer volume of logs that are being sent down the river, being turned into, they're all railroad ties at that point. You can kind of see the square shape if you look close. And so the railroads were coming across the west, and so the watershed was being, harvested of trees. So neither trees nor grass were being left behind to hold the sediment in place. And that sediment, like I said, went down into the Rio Grande. This isn't too interesting of a photo. It's just kind of a old photo of an old mining town and a reap photo of that. But what I want to show, if you can see my mouse, is this white line up here. That is actually the Rio Grande, back when this was taken, probably in 1890, as it says. And what's interesting is there's not a tree to be found. It kind of underscores what I said earlier, that this, and this is right outside of Socorro. So the Bosque, like I said, as we think of it as this continuous sea of trees all the way down to Elephant Butte, didn't exist at all back in 1890. It's just this wide sandy plain right here. And then in this modern one, repeat photo, all this dark area is all the trees that are now currently the Bosque. So now we come up into the 1900s, as mentioned, the Middle Rio Grande Conservancy District, which is basically, they're in charge of irrigation water deliveries to farmers in the Middle Rio Grande Valley. And one of the major things, they did a lot of bank line protections, and that's what this is. Picture this being a series of logs pounded into the side of the river, and then endless seas of cable and metal netting put over that, just straight over the bank. So this would have been where the bank was at this point in time, up to the height of this cable, and they were just trying to hold that bank in place because they were having local erosion problems. And then this is what we call the Riverside Drain, and this is what I'm talking about, where over here is the levee, and then this is the drain. So they accomplished two purposes at the same time. They dug the drain, used the spoil to build a levee, because of course levees do provide protection for your cities and your farmers. And then by creating the drain, they create this area of flowing water that basically keeps water moving. So what was saturated soil, as I mentioned earlier, is now has an outlet, if you will, and starts making its way downstream. Diversion dams, of course, were a huge impact on the river system. Obviously, fish can't get through them the way they're designed, and they change things as a matter of sediment load and all kinds of things. But if you're trying to back up water so you can force it into a irrigation ditch so that you can send it out to farmers, it's what you need to do. This chart down here is nothing you need to pay super close attention to. I just wanted to, I put it in there because it gives you an idea of the complexity of our irrigation system, that it's all this series of ditches that go throughout. This is just Angostura, which is Algodones, just north of Bernalillo, and then this is Isleta. So this is kind of the complicated infrastructure that's been put in place to bring water off the river to farmers. So it's actually kind of an interesting system in its own right. Just as a side note, going back to Aldo, he actually, when he was Secretary of the Chamber of Commerce in Albuquerque, actually advocated for the creation of the Middle Rio Grande Conservancy District. So he understood its importance to the development, even though he was very ecologically aware and probably had some sense of what how it would change the river system. Then we come up to the 50s and through the 70s, and the main significant thing that happened at the Rio at this time was what's called Jetty Jacks. So they're basically giant versions of jacks, the little things you played with when you were a kid, when you dropped a ball and tried to see how many you could pick up in your hand. And they are super effective at channelizing a river. So they're put in, as you can see in this photo here, put in one after another and strung together with cable. And they're put in rows. If you live in Albuquerque, you're very familiar with them because you've seen them in the Albuquerque Bosque, no doubt. And they are super effective at keeping the river channelized, because when floods go over bank and go through the Jetty Jacks, all the debris gets caught in the Jetty Jacks, and all of that collectively works as basically a flood control system. And so the water basically is held in that area until it can slowly drain back into the river, where the river is. These, over 100,000 of these were put in, 154,000 to be closer to exact. And we know that because they were purchased as units. And so some grad student at UNM at one point did a study and figured out from Army Corps records that they did 154,000 of them. So these things are throughout. And the biggest problem they create is now when we have bosque fires, which again, I'll come to, they are a huge impediment to just getting through the bosque to try and fight that fire. So, on the left, you can see that, every project that we did back then should lead to more projects where we now have to undo things, but that's just where we're at now. And then again, Cochiti Dam just threw this whole, flipped the whole system on its head. Prior to that, you see 11 million tons per year coming down the system of sediment. After 1973, 2 million tons a year. And then the map on the other side just shows all the different diversions and dams that have been built along the Rio Grande all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. So what does that mean? So the Cochiti Dam, of course, is up here, and this map, it covers a couple hundred miles. It goes all the way down past Socorro. But what it's showing you is the kind of lighter blue right here is major incision that's occurred. And incision means the river is incised itself. The bed of it is physically dropped, and the floodplain is now 8 to 10 feet above it. And then you can see it gets even, they use another darker blue line right here, and that's where you come into the Pueblo of Sandia. And so that's a lot of what I'm dealing with is working where the floodplain or the bosque is now 10 plus feet above the river system. And when you drop a river system like that, degrade the river, if you will, the water table also drops. So the water that used to be up close to where the roots of the trees and the riparian vegetation could get to it is now dropped with the river. It's now 10 feet down. The older cottonwoods were big enough and able to keep their root systems down. What we're seeing now is we'll get new flood adapted cottonwood or flood created cottonwoods from like the few floods we've had in the past couple of decades, say 2007, I believe. And they're now dying, even though they're closer to the river than the big cottonwoods, but they just didn't have time to develop the root system needed to develop with this to handle what this horrible year that we're having. So the river's really low, and they're just starting to die off. And then you can see the different effects as you go through. And then of course, what's interesting is down here is rapidly aggrading, because all that sediment that's being taken from the sediment starved waters of Cochiti, as I mentioned, and through these diversion dams and through more incision has to go somewhere. And of course it can't go past Elephant Butte. And so now what you're getting is the opposite, which is rapidly aggrading. This is just an example of the problems that created. The corral siphon is a infrastructure piece that was designed to take water from the east side of the river over to the west side, and when they built it back in the 30s, they buried the top of it 8 feet below the river. And now the river is literally pouring over it. It was never meant to see the light of day again, and you can actually walk on the very top of it now. So just kind of underscoring the incision problem. This is a graph that kind of highlights what the river's been doing over the time. As I mentioned, when they built the Corrales siphon, this was the elevation of the river, and the siphon was right here. And now, over time, you can see these are the different years. So the most recent is January 12th. This is one of the slides I'd hope to update. But anyways, it underscores the point that the river is just dropping and dropping and dropping, and now it's right against. So that siphon is actually acting as a grade control method. Another graph just kind of underscoring, this is where the bed of the river was when the Cochiti Dam was built, starting at about Bernalillo. This is where Bernalillo would be. These are a couple of the royals. The siphon that I just mentioned would be about right here. And so just in under 40 years, you can see how much it's dropped, which is, in many places 8-10 feet. And of course, this is, 2001 data. So now add another 20 years on top of that. What this looks like in my stretch of the river that I work at is we're seeing these huge cut banks. In restoration, cut banks aren't necessarily so bad, because what's forming on the other side over here is a point bar that's closer to the river and actually has flood generated cottonwood and willow. The problem is it just underscores what you're seeing here, which is these old cottonwoods are no longer, you can see how far down their roots can go, but these are old trees, super old trees. These guys are probably even older than the 40s, because I can see them in some of the older aerials. And so they were able to keep up with the dropping water, but and then since this photo was taken, this cut bank has actually moved in and just dropped most of these trees into the water, but they probably didn't have long for this world anyways. And then this is just a note that if you live in Albuquerque, you probably are familiar with just below the Alameda Bridge is the San Juan Chama diversion. dam, which is basically they take water out of the river and they clean it up and actually make it our drinking water. And just with the dam that they put in place, which is really a low cost kind of thing, you can see in 2005, right before they put the diversion dam in, how deep the river channel was. And then just 7 years later, how much it brought it back up. So there are ways to deal with incision that are pretty low cost, but it's still, many times it's a matter of will and agency. There's challenges with dealing with the managing agencies as well as the cost. I'm going to go through this super quick, but I just want to give you, so unfortunately I don't have any photos that go back before we had the levee. So Middle Rio Grande Conservancy District built the levee back in the 20s, or sorry, early 30s, and this photos from 35, and you can see they've already built it, and the Riverside Drain. But the thing to see in this next series of slides that I'm going to go through quickly is how wide the river is right here. So it's really wide and sandy with just a few pieces of vegetation along the sides. What's also interesting is how much cottonwood trees and bosque there is. You can actually see the old flood lines where the floods went into Corrales. So there were probably farms and stuff, and then they kept going back and forth. But once the levee was there, you'll see as we go, more and more farms, they're now protected from the floods of the river. And so more and more they reclaim, as they would say, the land for farming behind the levee. And then we jump into the 70s. So this is kind of the last year before Cochiti Dam really starts showing its effects. You can still see it's a really wide river. And then we'll jump ahead 20 more years. You can see the river is narrowing. It's got islands. All of the vegetation on the side is becoming entrenched because there's very little overbank flooding after 20 years of incision. And then now look how tiny the river is. And now obviously the width of the river is just happens to be how much water was in it the day that they took the photo. But really, it wouldn't matter. Even if it was a good year, it wouldn't be that much wider. The river has made a deeper channel for itself, so more water can be moved in a smaller surface area. And so the river is really, really narrowed up, and that's kind of the underscoring point here. So all of this has led to 50 years. The Jetty Jacks in particular stabilized everything, as I mentioned earlier, and that really allowed for the non-native vegetation, particularly the salt cedar and the Russian olive, to grow up thick under this cottonwood canopy. And so what you have now is a tinderbox waiting to happen. It's just like building a campfire. You start with the smaller stuff, and then you put the bigger logs on top of that and use the smaller stuff to get it going. So now you've got these non-native trees that are grown, you know, halfway up the understory of the cottonwoods. And once they get going, and they burn hotter than most other woods do, they can get the entire cottonwood forest going, and you have these really catastrophic fires. In the early 2000s, I had just moved here, and in 2000, it was 2001 or 2, they had a big fire in the South Valley's bosque, and it was kind of everybody's oh my God moment, where we realized what we were sitting on top of in terms of a tinderbox and fires like this just waiting to happen. So what happened after that was they went through a huge process of just mulching and masticating. So if you've ever been hiking through the bosque and you just see all this thick woody debris on the ground, it's because a machine like this went through and just ground down, literally just using its arm and grinding down all the non-native trees. That was kind of their preferred method. It was the cheapest per acre. It's in retrospect not the best thing to do because it's harder to get a fire going. But if you do get a fire going, as happened on the Pueblo of Sandia in 2012, all that wood on the ground actually just sits there and burns like charcoal. And so you end up sterilizing the entire soil. So it's harder to get a fire going, but if you get it going, it does more damage. It's that area 8 years later is still just a patch of weeds because the soil's still dead, basically. It's still recovering. The other thing they did, of course, is spray lots of herbicides. So you cut the tree and you spray herbicide around the cambium and you go from there. So now you might be thinking, well, good Lord, everything we do seems to lead to bigger problems. Why don't we just stop? Well, we can't. We've kind of gotten trapped in this cycle where we have to deal with this tinderbox or inferno of potential inferno that we've created. And then further, we have the Endangered Species Act, which has made us very aware of how much we're impacting our ecosystems around us, that, you know, we're bringing species to the brink of extinction. And so the Endangered Species Act, of course, was designed to step in and try and be a stopgap measure that helped save these species and recover them. Here in the Middle Rio Grande Valley, of course, that's the Silvery minnow and the willow flycatcher, the probably two most known. The yellow-billed cuckoo just recently had designated critical habitat that includes much of the Middle Rio Grande Valley designated for it, and really just gives a layer of protection, saying that it doesn't stop everything. Like we're still able to do projects in the bosque, whether it's fuels reduction or actual restoration, but we do have to give some thought to how that project will affect, in particular, these endangered species. So now I'll get to the restoration, the modifications, if you will, because there's different methods, but all of them kind of have an idea of they're trying to restore native riparian vegetation through some form or fashion, and they're, if possible, trying to tie into what are the needs of the endangered species, and I'll mention that more as we go. The general positives is reconnection of floodplain and flood dissipation. One of the challenges with incised rivers is the floodwaters now are held within that small area of the river because the banks are now 10 feet high. So if you remove a big chunk of the bank, then the water can spread out and go and restore that floodplain function. It also helps dissipate a flood. You know, that's what floodplains are, is just floodwaters going outward and losing their energy. If you have an area by the river and the river is able to interact with that floodplain, you generally get a natural regeneration of natives, especially the cottonwoods that we're so concerned about. Habitat diversity and mosaic is always good. When in doubt, just go for diversity in your ecosystem. And then, of course, endangered species benefits. The general negatives is when you disturb areas, as we can see from DOT and their maintenance, or MRGCD scraping ditches or whatever, every time you scrape ground or do something, you create a disturbance, and then you make it ripe for tumbleweed, kochia, Vervena grass, all these different weedy species that move in very quick. When I first started working at the Pueblo 9 years ago, there was no kochia up there. It was in Albuquerque, but it wasn't on the in the Pueblo, and now it's every highway and every road through the Pueblo has kochia and tumbleweed. So all these things just move and they follow disturbance, and as long as we keep doing maintenance in the way we do along our roads and ditches, they're going to keep spreading. They have a relatively short lifespan. I'll talk more about that in a second, but the benefits still outweigh that fact. I'm just pointing it out that is one of the negatives, that strangely enough, that you create this system where you open up a floodplain or do a bank lowering, but then as soon as the river hits it, even though it's sediment starved, it does have sediment, but then it hits these floodplains that you've created and it drops all its sediment right there, because that's the first chance it's had to lose its energy. And so you immediately get an aggradation that then cuts itself off from the river. And then, of course, non-natives are out there. Their seed sources there, and they're going to take advantage of what you've done as well. So ponds are, in my opinion, underutilized. It's a great way to create open water, habitat diversity, increase the mosaic within your bosque. Birds love them, dragonflies love them, frogs love them. You know, it's on the river as you run into the rules of the compact, and and you may not be able to take that water, if you will, because it's you're taking water away, I guess you would say. And ponds, they kind of, a lot of times, that as long as it's just open water and it's not flowing, they'll allow these. So if you're familiar with Tingley, that was, again, actually, apparently I just learned through New Mexico Magazine, that was a design that goes back to Aldo himself, which is just another plug for Aldo. But anyways, ponds throughout the bosque, and the Pueblo actually they were old borrow pits, basically, from the creation of the levee. And these are some of our best habitat. Now you get into we're actually modifying banks or creating what's called a willow swale. So, and a swale is just what it sounds like. It's a lowered area, either right on the bank or within the floodplain. And then in these cases, you'll see in all, they're planted really heavily with willow. You can see all the willow. And willow and it's amazing. You can go back you can see how they're all planted in rows there, but you can go back in 5 or 10 years and not even be able to tell that the rows were planted in, because it fills in so nicely. Terrace feature is kind of a exaggerated version. You can see the river barely off to the right here, but it's literally, you can see how much is being removed here to allow the river to now overbank this area. And they call it a terrace feature because they terraced it up. So by the river, it's designed to inundate at 1500 CFS. CFS is cubic feet per second. It's just a way of measuring water flow. If you see the river right now in Albuquerque, if you've driven over the Alameda Bridge, that's 200 CFS. It's really crazy low. 1500 is kind of an a moderate average flow, and then 2,000, 2,500 and above is when you start getting into like your spring floods or monsoon floods. And here's that same feature. The machine would have been right there, you know, well down the road, but you can see how well the willow has filled in. This is on its way to being future bosque. Within that, these are native recruitment cottonwoods. They simply waited for the next flood to happen over that created terrace, and when the floods happened, the seeds responded and sprouted, and now we got this nice future cottonwood gallery here. The other thing you also see, of course, is all this blue-gray right here is Russian olive, and that's just part of the deal. And I'll talk more about maintenance in a bit. Let's see. And then one thing I recommend actually in a bit, next slide, is one of the problems I saw with restoration projects as I started this job and started learning about them is that agencies would go in and do these big, huge projects, and then they would just basically leave them and let, you know, nature do its thing. And I wish they had done a smaller footprint and spent more of that money going back into the areas that they had created. For example, here we use this deal. It has a clamp on the bottom and a lever basically, and you put the clamp at the bottom of your plants, and this is all Russian olive that was pulled up using a gizmo like this. And but unfortunately, we only were able to have Army Corps do that once, and you know, you need at least several 3 or 4 times to get on top of the non-natives resprouting. So a backwater is just what it sounds like. It's an area that, so the river is over here carving in this way, and then this is a backwater. It's just designed to let the higher flows back into it. This area, unfortunately, I didn't get a chance to update the photo, but has turned into a really nice wetland and riparian area. And the recurring theme here is just because we lowered the sediment and allowed the river to inundate and interact with the land, we've got mostly native wetland and riparian vegetation. Flow-through channels are some of my favorite. If you've ever been to the Rio Grande Nature Center, they have probably one of the more known ones. The Pueblo has one, and flow-through channels, what it sounds like, it takes water off the river, runs it through a channel, and then back to the river further downstream. And over time, well, one of the challenges, let me step back a second. One of the challenges, what I talked about, were whenever the river overbanks and comes in here, it immediately drops sediment because it's the first time it's had a chance to lose energy. And so this right here is the river connected 1100 CFS, which is really low water. It's just, you know, not much. And then here we're at 2500 CFS, over twice that amount, and the river's not connecting, just kind of indicating how much sediment got deposited at the mouth of it. Also, continued incising is also lowering the river, and it's kind of hard to say which is creating more disconnect here, but it just underscores that that's one of the challenges. And if we had kind of written it in that we could immediately go in and dig out these plugs at the front of these features, we could have kept it connected longer. But the fact that we lowered it and created this channel, lowered it and created an area closer to groundwater, even if the river doesn't flow through it, it's still able to grow in, as you can see here, quite nicely with native vegetation. This blue line is what I call the dry line, and it's one of the challenges of restoration. Over here, close to groundwater or where the river can interact, it's all willow, cottonwood, tree willow, or Gooding's willow. It's all wonderful. It's beautiful, and this is many years ago. It's all grown in really lush now. But above that line, it's dry, and so this is all tumbleweed, and that's just one of the challenges of doing these projects is you're going to have disturbance areas that just go through a weed phase. And they say these weeds cycle through in 2 or 3 years. I'm in areas waiting 6, 7 years, and it's still coming back mostly as tumbleweed. So it's a huge challenge that we need to learn to address. This is a kind of similar to the willow swale. It's just a bank lowering. What's interesting to me about this area is this one was done a long time ago before those others that I showed you, and they didn't plant it. And all they did was lower the bank, as you can see right here, and then left it, and the river's back here. So this one was not planted, which is interesting. All the others have been heavily planted with Rosa Willow, as I showed you. This one wasn't planted. So above what I call the dry line, as you can see, it's all tumbleweed. But then over here, without us doing anything at all, these are all cottonwood and willow that completely came in on their own. So it kind of speaks to sometimes all you got to do is let the river have an interaction with the landscape by lowering the banks and not even spend all the extra time and effort on the planting, or give it a year or two, and if no responses happen, then go in and plant a bunch of willow. But the problem, as I keep coming back to, is most budgets designed to do this kind of work, it's like one project, bam, move on, and so you don't have that money to come back, or they put it on the landowner to do that, in this case the pueblo. But the pueblo has a large land base to take care of, and having to come back and do that level of planting for somebody else's project is just too much to ask. So, these are, again, just kind of the ongoing challenges, but they do work. This is that same embayment when it's got a little bit of overbank flooding in it. That's all baby cottonwoods that came in all entirely on their own. The cranes obviously are loving it. Very little non-native recruitment in here, which was a surprise to me in retrospect with some of my experience on my other projects. But this area is just now, what are we at, 8 years later, and these cottonwoods are 10 to 15 feet tall. They're filled in. There's very little Russian olive in between them. This is all sedge right here, just natural wetland vegetation, just beautiful. One more view of the same thing, and this is kind of the inside is just what I'm talking about, where this thing was built for 1500 CFS, and at 1800 CFS you can see how low. So again, a bunch of sediment got deposited on top, but the end result is mostly a good, healthy future bosque that we look forward to having. So I know I've been talking fast, but there's a lot to cover, and I want to wrap up in time to allow for some Q&A if there's any. So let me just kind of finish up with some thoughts on these modifications, restoration structures. And all these projects you have a starting budget that you have to work within, and kind of ideas of what you can do with that budget, however you acquired that money, whatever grant or federal agency that had funding or whatever the case may be. But if you're going to do a bank lowering, you got to balance with your budget with trying to remove as much sediment as possible. The more you can do that first time around when the machines are there, the better. That's your, bang for your buck. Is the machines are coming out, you've already paid to haul them out there, you're already paying the guy to sit in them and do the work. Get as much sediment as you can, and a lot of these things are designed, say, for 1500 CFS is like their target. I would drop that down to 1000 or even 500 CFS, really give the river a chance to interact with that bank lowering that you've created. But on the other hand, save as much money as you can to do multiple follow-ups. Rather than one big area that you hit once, I think it makes a lot more sense to hit a smaller area, like target it where you have the most non-natives that you need to get rid of anyways, and then stick to a smaller footprint and save money to go back into that area multiple times to get those non-native resprouts that are just inevitable. One thing that's not done enough is seeding, and that often brings up the debate of like how native is the seed or something like that. We have a system that's been modified for 300 years now, as I point out in this talk. What we need is a system that functions well, especially for pollinators. If you're tuning into this, you're probably aware enough to know that we're having problems with honeybees and all kinds of pollinator issues and stuff like that. And a lot of what that comes down to is we just don't have enough plants that benefit these pollinators. So when you have a chance, do some seeding, get some color out in your bosque, basically. We need to overcome the reluctance of the managing agencies to allow sediment to be deposited in the river. That's a huge expense. And when we do these bank lowerings, the thing that makes most sense is if it's already a degrading incised river, just push the sediment in the river and let it do its thing. That's a complicated deal for many reasons, but we need to overcome that reluctance. It's kind of coming, over time they're understanding that, but it's still just kind of a memory, if you will, of these agencies that they always said no to sediment in their rivers. And the Rio Grande was always a sediment filled river, so let's just get back to that. So big challenges coming into the future. We're seeing it this year, especially in 2020. Human-induced climate change is already doing exactly what it was predicted to. I mean, I learned about it in my natural resources classes back in the 90s, and everything has come true. Reduced precipitation, especially snowfall. As we're seeing this year, we had an average snowpack, and yet we have no water in our rivers, and we never had really a spring flow. What happened? Well, it melted off early. It was dry ground that it was melting onto, so it absorbed very quickly. And so even though we have, quote, average snowpack based on the last 30-year average, we have one of the worst water years on record. And this is just what we're going to continue to see. So what a bosque is and what it means into the future with less water is just going to become ever more challenging. And then, of course, as we're seeing with all this haze that we've been surrounded by, warmer temperatures, especially here in the Southwest, and this will worsen the fire season, and we're already seeing that. So, and then I just kind of point out the Rio Grande Compact, which I told you shares water between the states and stuff, and all these other treaties and laws that we deal with. Many of them were written before hydrology and sciences like biology, ecology, et cetera, were commonly used words, much less advanced sciences that we are now. So we're operating in a system that was, designed before we had the science that's developed to tell us like, oh, wow, we should have never done that to begin with, but we're now kind of stuck in that system. And for better or worse, we're just gonna have to move forward with that. Changes in your immediate bosque. Here's a picture on the Pueblo where we had a mysterious tree die-off, and we're seeing that more and more. It's just the cottonwoods are getting old, the river's getting incised, and this is the future. And what will come in is Siberian elm and Russian olive. So a future bosque that's completely unmanaged will become a Siberian/Russian olive bosque. That's just what's going to come in to dominate unless we actively manage for preservation of cottonwoods. And what's interesting about managing for cottonwoods is they need overbank floating, and so does the silvery minnow, which is an endangered species. So it's like, what does a tree have in common with a fish? Well, in the Rio Grande, everything, that they have the same needs. The silvery minnow needs overbank flooding so that it has time when it in its life cycle where it has areas with slower moving water that it can grow and develop. And that's what's missing in a lot of the river system. And then finally, one last note, if you're not familiar with Vervena grass, it's this kind of bushy, kind of like, if you know a pampas grass, they look very similar. They're actually two different families, but it's a big bushy plant that sends up a stalk, tons of seeds. And it's only come into the bosque probably in the last 15, 20 years. We dealt with a huge infestation on the Pueblo. We did so by digging it out. Which is labor intensive. We have a good relationship with some youth corps and found some funding and just went that method. And but otherwise your option is just a lot of herbicide. But either way, it's something that needs to be dealt with because it's invasive, not in just that it will take over disturbed areas. The infestation I have, which is this which is this upper corner here, you can see how thick it is. It just came in and took over. So there's invasive where they take over disturbed areas or weeds, and then there's invasive where they actually push things out. And this one will push things out. So learn what it is and take a shovel and just dig around it. And for the most part, that'll prevent it from growing any further. So with that, I will say thank you for your attention, and I will then send it back over to Kristen and let her give me any Q&A that may be out there. But thank you for tuning in. I saw there was a nice little list of people there, and obviously I have a lot of passion for this, for what I do. And if you're interested in learning more about restoration in general, feel free to get in touch or reach out through the Albuquerque Wildlife Federation and get on our mailing list and come join us on a project, because that's the best way to learn about this.
Wow, thank you. That was super interesting. I really liked that. So we do have a couple questions. A lot of people are saying thank you and giving you claps, which is great. So we have, can the silvery minnow be reintroduced and population kept okay with the river drying most years?
So the interesting thing about the minnow in that case is it's already reintroduced. They grow it out in fish hatcheries and supplement the population pretty much every year. So they're already doing that. This year, as I mentioned, how bad the water year has been, down below Albuquerque, I believe in the Isleta Reach, we have about 8 to 10 miles of dry riverbed, and below Socorro, there's like 30 miles of dry riverbed. They do fish rescue, but you're really just kind of putting the fish in a stressful situation and then dumping it back in a river upstream. They don't have a good sense of whether those guys actually survive or not. So it's a wonder if it's worth the effort. Yeah, where endangered species really create these challenges for you that you got to think through is how do we keep the species alive? It's part of the river system for a reason, but you know, the rivers change so much, and the drying of it is just going to continue to be a huge challenge. So, I mean, there's not a clear answer to your question there. Like I said, they're already supplementing the population with hatchery grown fish, and these bank lowering efforts in particular, the creating the floodplain benefits the minnow. We know that as we learn more about its life cycle, but how long we're going to be able to keep that up, and what that'll mean in the future, or whether we just have to accept that the minnow is only going to exist. The minnow used to exist throughout the entire Rio Grande, and now it only has a couple of distinct populations from you know, the Middle Rio Grande Valley and down in Big Bend, which they reintroduced and seems to actually be holding on. But anyways, we may just have to accept that, you know, it's only going to be between the Sleda and Cochiti until we get some kind of pendulum swing on the climate, which I don't see happening.
Okay. So then we have Mara asks if mastication is not such a great idea for invasive vegetation control, what are the preferred alternative methods?
I wish I had a ready-made answer for that one. Let me just kind of put this out. I try and go organic as I can about everything in life, as I think many of us on tuning into this do. But I recognize there is a place for herbicides, and that's when I'm dealing with these really difficult plants. And what makes elm and Russian olive and tree of heaven and salt cedar so difficult is if you cut them or burn them or do anything like that, they simply resprout from their root. They have just this amazing root system. They're called phreatophytes, and that's a term where they just can readily resprout from the roots. And so if you extract them, so you can use mechanical methods like extraction, well, every point that root breaks when you do the extracting, because you're not going to get it all, also resprouts. So one, it kind of goes into my kind of underlying theme here, which is always plan multiple visits to your project sites. So one would be that your first time in, you're using a mechanical method, you go in with machines and you extract as much as you can. And then the second time you're going in, either with machines or with herbicide, and targeting the resprouts, because they're smaller, they will actually be susceptible to the herbicide. You know, you can go with that. Extraction is like anything, all these processes are expensive, even herbicide's expensive. You still got to pay somebody, the chemicals are not cheap. Extraction, you've got the machinery and the person running it and people on the ground, because then you get, once you extract a tree, it's not like you finish the job, you didn't have all that biomass. What are you going to do with it? Are you removing it from the site? Well, that's a cost. Are you piling it up and burning? Well, then you got to wait, you know, into the future and plan to count. You know, all of these just need to be thought through on any particular site. But what we do at the Pueblo is kind of an herbicide last philosophy, which is go in with extraction first. Whether that's hand extraction, like I showed you on that weed wrench, that you can, if you get in when things are small and you can get in with just manual labor like that, shovels and weed wrenches and pickaxes can do wonders. If you're at the next phase where the trees are a bit taller, you're probably needing machinery to extract them, and then having to plan to come back the next year when the broken roots resprout, and then you have to choose herbicide or not. And then there's certain areas where we just need to get in and get the work done, and more often than not, for example, a railroad right away where we can't actually go into the right of way, but the elms keep coming in and are a seed source to the Pueblo, we'll just go along the railroad right away and spray that, because it's really the only option we have. So kind of an all of the above, but the mastication just speaks to, you got to think through what you're doing with your biomass. You don't just magically get rid of the tree when you kill it or extract it. Or grind it. It goes somewhere, and with mastication, it all ends up in the ground. So on the one hand, you're covering the ground so you don't get weeds, but then you don't get native vegetation either. And then on the other hand, like I said, if a fire does happen, you've just made things worse.
Okay. So then we have a couple more. I know we're a little over time, but I think they're great questions. So, so Beth has, are any of the other Pueblos or riverfront landowners working together to implement any of the management recommendations you mentioned. And I'm actually going to ask you to turn on your video if you're comfortable.
Oh.
I don't know. It's nice to see your face.
Aw. Oh, yes, very much so. Every pueblo in the Middle Rio Grande Valley and probably the upper, probably even upper above Cochiti, I think every pueblo has some form of forestry program. I mean, it's a bosque, but it's still trees, so it's considered a forestry program. So every one of them has some kind of forestry program that they're dealing with, fuels reduction, which is targeted on getting rid of non-native. They have habitat enhancement, where they're trying to, like all the things I talked about, like bank lowering ponds or different things like that. Almost, I think all the Middle Rio Grande Pueblos have signed on to the collaborative program, where we're all trying to work together to just kind of learn more about these endangered species, and then learn what activities we can and cannot do that will benefit or harm them. Down in, say, Socorro area, there's a awesome woman named Beth who retired from Bosque del Apache, and there's a lot of private landowners actually have stuff along the Rio Grande, and she's worked with them to get them to do similar activities. She retired from the Bosque del Apache and stayed in the area and just worked her knowledge and reached out to private landowners. So yes, you would, if you really dive into it, you'd be amazed at how much activity is going on in terms of trying to benefit some kind of semblance of native bosque and benefiting these endangered species. But these are tough challenges to deal with in the long run.
Right. Well, I'm glad that efforts are happening. Okay, so from Jamie, we have, what about the restoration work you've done has surprised you over the past 8 to 9 years? It's great that you've been able to do this work along the stretch of river for nearly a decade. So what surprised you?
What has surprised me, the biggest surprise coming into it was I think that embayment I showed the photo where no planting was done, no nothing. They just cleared the ground and let the river interact with the floodplain, and boom, you got this wonderful, lush, beautiful bosque. So, and I happen to know Jamie works in at a place where she might be able to be part of stuff like that as well, as far as trying to reconnect the river, although very different stretch than where I work at Sandia. But that's been kind of the most rewarding and surprising thing, was just kind of seeing it through with my own observations that, if a river is allowed to interact with the floodplain, you generally get a healthy bosque habitat. And you do have to be on top of it and do some additional maintenance and non-natives, because the seed sources are there and everything. But that's just been the most pleasant surprise is how well this landscape, even with what we're dealing with now with this hot and dry and everything, will rejuvenate and do great things if it's given the opportunity.
Okay. And then we have 3 questions from Genevieve. And I might actually, if you don't mind, she's a student that's studying cottonwoods from Johns Hopkins, but is located in Albuquerque. So she has some great questions. And I think maybe if I just put you in contact with her, would that be okay?
I'd welcome that, actually.
Perfect.
Cottonwoods are very studied
awesome.
in the grand scheme of things.
So just because we're running out of time, I'm going to ask one of her questions,
cool.
Which is, what does the riparian cottonwood ecosystem mean to Sandia Pueblo? How do they see their involvement in this restoration?
Gotta be careful. There's partly that, in broad terms, it's not very sensitive, but in more specific terms, after even working there 9-10 years, I still don't know a whole lot about that Pueblo Bosque interaction. But I know enough to know that the reason they have a Bosque program is because it's that important to them. The kind of what I've been able to piece together, you look at some of the original names of the Pueblos, because the Sandia obviously is Spanish for watermelon. They weren't originally the watermelon people. They were a name that translates to the green reed people, which is probably referring to the green reeds of the river. The vegetation along the river. Taos Pueblo, their original name translates into red willows. So it goes back to their original names, where you really get a sense of like they were always tied to the earth, to the land, and then further specifically tied to the river. That's what they named their people after. So that's kind of a broad answer, but what little I've pieced together with working at Sandia, it's best if I keep to myself. It's just part of working for a Pueblo. And then further, it's just, even what I do know, I don't fully comprehend the way somebody that grew up in their culture would be able to tell you if they were willing to. So I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, thank you. And then just out of curiosity, and a couple of people asked us, what herbicides are pose the least damage to animals and the ecosystem and all those things?
Unfortunately, the challenge with herbicides is you're trusting the people that profit from these chemicals to tell you they're safe, and then you're trusting a government agency that we all know can be suspect to also tell you they're safe and that they've done the studies to prove it. So putting that out there, I will say that the herbicides we use at the Pueblo and are used throughout most of the Middle Rio Grande Valley that I know of are ones that you don't need a license for. So they're not what they call restricted use herbicides or pesticides. Those are the really toxic ones, if you can imagine. But these are ones that you can find. They don't sell them at Home Depot, but you can find them there, for example. But then that's a horrible example in its own right, because glyphosate, we're learning, was always known to cause cancer, and Monsanto just kind of hid that information as long as they could continue making money off of it. And it's super effective. So, people saw results and they kept using it. So these issues get complicated. But cutting more to what we do use, because we won't use glyphosate, is which is what most people know as Roundup. We use triclopyr, which the most common brand name is Garlon, and then imazapyr, which the most common name is Habitat or Arsenal or Polaris AC. And they both have their pluses and minuses. Garlon is what we initially used a lot because the Pueblo has a lot of great grasses growing in their bosque, a lot of areas that are more like meadow, even under the Cottonwood bosque. And Garlon doesn't kill grasses, it only does broadleaf plants. So it made it nice, because then if you get some on the ground or you're spraying around a tree that has grass around it, it won't kill that grass. And so that was always good to see. Imazapyr has a little more potency, but you need less of it, and seems to work a little better. The challenge with the imazapyr is it stays active longer and will actually travel through the soil and get into your non-target plants. So you can spray, say, a Siberian elm that you're trying to get rid of, and if you're too close to a willow or a cottonwood, the chemical will then be taken up by that plant and killed off. That's why I say we take a kind of a herbicide last approach, but we do realize that if we're not going to just forever be dealing with small patches that we just need to move on from because we have 1,000 acres of bosque to deal with, we do include it. But anyways, the two chemical names that you need to know are triclopyr and imazapyr, and you can do your own further research from there. Like I said, Garlon and Habitat or Arsenal or Polaris are the main brand names.
Perfect. Thank you so much for answering all those great questions. Again, you were fantastic. Shell, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your expertise. And just for everyone that's still with us, we will be sending out a survey in the next couple of days. Please take a minute to fill that out. Let us know how we're doing. Maybe some extra programs you'd like to see. Again, you got more clappy hands, which is great. If you are interested in seeing more programs like this, please tune in to tomorrow. We're having a live stream at 10 a.m. in our wildlife observation room at the Los Alamos Nature Center with one of our phenomenal birders and volunteers, Bob Walker. So again, that's tomorrow, 10 a.m. Looking at fall birds that are coming through our observation area. And Shell, if you'd like to share anything that's going on with the Wildlife Federation, please do. But if not, thanks everyone for tuning in.
Yes, thanks to everyone. And yes, Albuquerque Wildlife Federation, one last plug. We do really fun, not only do we do good work on the ground, we have fun doing it. So check us out.
Yes, please do. And yeah, everyone have a good night. Thank you so much, Shell. You have a good night too. And yeah, thanks everyone.
Good night, all. Appreciate it.